Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Real World Data Protection Challenges webinar. Just before I get into the meat of the topic, just want to do a quick check on whether or not you can hear me. Hopefully that's coming across loud and clear. If you do have any problems, then you can always check your browser settings and look to switch which browser you're using if you are having any problems. Also, just to let you know that the session will be recorded. So if you have to duck out for any reason to take a phone call, then it will be available online on our YouTube channel and via our website early next week. And we will send you a link to the webinar for you. Just to reassure you also that it will only be the presentation slides that will be recorded. So if you do have questions that you want to pose at the end of the webinar, then you are welcome to use the chat pod, and that won't actually come through in the webinar recording. So it will only be visible to me and other participants. So, as I said, welcome to the webinar. Thank you very much for attending on a sunny afternoon. I'm sure you'd all much rather be at the pub, but hopefully you can pop out later for a quick drink. So my name is Regina LALLY. I'm the co-founder of Data Basics with Kelly, who usually runs the webinars, but she is luckily today actually relaxing in her garden. So you've got me today. I've got 15 years working with public and private sector data, working with Kelly largely across different aspects of data protection and data management. And I really focus on the side of how to engage people and making data protection something practical that they can apply in their roles rather than theoretical. So hopefully that will be something that you will find useful today. So today's session, we're going to be looking at some of the things that we as an organisation have been hearing and experiencing with our clients over the past 6 months, really, some of the frequent questions that are coming in and some of the insights that we've learned from that. And hopefully that will help you to take back to your businesses and apply some good practice and hopefully tackle some of the challenges that you might be aware of or may face in the coming months. So just very quickly, I'm just going to reflect on some of the principles of the GDPR and the ones that we'll be focusing on today. So the core one really that I think comes through today is that honesty and transparency with clients. So that first principle of fairness, having clear purpose, making sure that you can actually explain to people what you're doing with their data and why you're doing it. The other element that will come through quite strongly will be that security. I think the increased challenges of people working from home and the news, there's quite significant pieces of news at the moment around data breaches. So we'll touch on some of those issues and what's happening and how you can try and think ahead and hopefully prevent them happening in the first place. Also, some of the elements we'll touch on individual rights, so where people have made subject access requests, upholding their ability to access data and how you can, again, linking back to the transparency element, make sure that they're clear about what you're doing and why. And that accountability element will obviously also come through. So those are some of the areas that we'll be considering. And what I really want to do is to sort of focus on what's happening now. What are we seeing coming through the queries, the questions that are worrying and concerning businesses and data protection leads that we're talking to at the moment. So the first scenario that I've picked for you is a query that we had not too long ago. It came from a company that they'd gone through a process of sending out initial emails to people that they had identified through LinkedIn as potentially being interested in attending webinars or events that they wanted to put on. And they really looked at local area, who would be interested, the size of business, and they'd actually also use a lead generation tool to actually identify those clients in LinkedIn, to pull them out, and then to provide them with the contact information that they could then email separately outside of LinkedIn. Now, one of the people that received that email sent a subject access request in because they weren't sure about where that information had come from, why they were receiving the email, and they referred to where have I consented to provide to receive marketing emails from you. Now, part of the issue was when we looked into it was that the lead generation software doesn't just identify people in LinkedIn and then give you the information that's in LinkedIn, it also then harvests data or drags data from other public data sources and other information that's available, but it's not very clear in its policy about where that data is coming from. So the company who was sending out the prospective marketing emails weren't actually able to identify where that email had come from. And initially, they thought that they were emailing the address that was linked to the LinkedIn account. What it turned out was actually because of this data harvesting from other areas, it had actually come from somewhere else that they weren't actually able to identify because the lead generation tool wasn't clear about where they had got that data from either. So the company, they fulfilled the subject access request. They replied within the required timescales. The initial response outlined their understanding of what they had done in terms of the information that had come from LinkedIn. But the data subject actually responded and said, well, actually, it's a different email. That's not the one that's linked to my LinkedIn account, which highlighted the issue that the lead generation software was actually pulling data from elsewhere. So they had to respond and say, this is the software that we're using, and outline the fact that whilst the primary source of information and identification of that individual as a point of interest was LinkedIn, the software system had added to it and obviously provided this data that they couldn't actually tell them where the source of that data was. So what is it that you can take from this? I'd say if you are going to use lead generation tools, you need to have a look at their privacy notices. Try and understand where they get their data from. If they're not fully clear, if they talk about other data sources or purely publicly available, you can ask them those questions. They should be transparent about their data sources. Obviously, they might be worried about the fact that they might have access to particular sources that they feel are their USP. So it might be worth picking up the phone and having a conversation to be sure with them. What is it? Where is it that they're getting their data from? Is it purely linked to the systems that they name, or do they have additional sources? Because if they can't be transparent with you, it's going to make it very challenging for you to be transparent with your customers, with your prospects, about how you've got their data. You then have to be clear in your privacy notice that you do use lead generation tools. There's nothing wrong with using them inherently. I think you have to look and understand what it is they do, how are you using them, what's your process, map that process, and then be very clear in your privacy notice and explaining to individuals that this is what you do. You can identify new leads, new prospects as part of growing your business, but you always need to balance that off against the impact that it has on the privacy of the individual. So obviously using business information is going to be less of an impact than using personal information. So you really want to be making sure that any lead generation tools you're using are going to be using the appropriate contact information to contact those individuals, so they're not surprised and not expecting that kind of approach through the communication channel that you choose. You can also help when you are communicating with those prospects for the first time. Don't forget about the right to be informed. You need to tell them on that first communication where you got their data from. So how have you identified them? Why are you contacting them? It can be friendly. It doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be legalese, but it can be very clear and just say, you know, we've been looking on LinkedIn, identified your company as a business that might be interested in what we're offering, and I'd like to have a conversation with you, or would you like to attend our webinar or event that we're running? And always give them the opportunity to opt out. That's where legitimate interests come into it. If they then ask where you got the data from, you need to be able to be prepared to share that back with them. But if you can tell them and explain to them in the first instance, you might actually allay some of those queries and avoid getting a subject access request at all. So transparency is key there. It helps to build trust. And if you think about privacy at any point that you're choosing different tools that can help you identify people for approaching for business purposes, that will always help you. I know some of them give great insight. I've seen a few that will give you a profile around people's interests, how they react, the kind of characteristics they have based on the language they've used on their profile. But you really have to consider what the intrusion on their privacy would be. Moving on to the next scenario, we've helped one of our customers with a subject access request that came through from a disgruntled employee. Now, the employee was going through a grievance process at the time, and they put in a subject access request. They wanted to understand particular data, what was held about them, what had been said. Often what will be being looked for here is if the individual suspects that there might be opinions that have been written about them, if there's been particular information that has been shared about them that they feel might be pertinent or relevant to the case, or they're digging to find out if there's things that they're not aware of that they want to be aware of that they feel might help them. So the employee had been with the company for a number of years, so that potentially meant that there was a lot of information to search, and the organisation was a bit worried about what the subject access request covered. And they, again, were asking for information that was relating to the grievance process, which is still ongoing. It hadn't finished at that point. And so, again, the company were a bit concerned that were they able to give this, did they have to give it out? But it could actually then impact on the process because the individual would have knowledge of information at a time that would be prior to what they needed it. And also they requested personal data of colleagues, sort of performance for comparative purposes. It was to see, how were they comparing against their colleagues and was there fairness involved? So the advice that we were giving them and helping them through this was very much looking at what is it that they should give? Can they look at where somebody's been working for you for a long time? Can you look at actually trying to clarify the amount of information that they're interested in? Is it a particular period? So actually, when it went to it, they were looking for information that was in relation to the year prior to the grievance process that was taking place, and they wanted that information in relation to the decisions that have been made and the process that have been followed up until that point. And so rather than then having to go back and search through everything, they're able to narrow that down. But if the individual doesn't clarify, then you absolutely would have to go through all of the records that link to that individual and actually reply and give them access to the information that they have the right to see. The other element is if it is related to a grievance process, if it is to do with redundancy and that process is ongoing, there may be an exemption to you having to reply to that part of the subject access request, in that individuals can't use a subject access request to circumvent processes or legal processes that would then impact on the fairness or ability of that process to be followed appropriately. So if you're going through redundancy processes at the moment, or see that might happen in the future, you don't actually have to give information about the roles, restructuring potential, anything like that in advance of that being made more widely known. It can't be used to circumvent that sort of confidential management, planning and forecasting that needs to happen prior to individuals being notified. The other element there that we picked up on around the individual wanting access to other colleagues' information for comparative purposes, they don't have the right to see that. A subject access request only gives them the right to access their own personal data. So the company refused to provide that with the explanation that they didn't have the right to access that information. Things like where it's been emails that the individual sent out as part of their normal course of business, those don't have to be included simply because it's got the email address and signature and name of that individual in their role as an employee. That is somewhere their information will appear, and you can allude to that in the response, but you don't have to print out every single copy and give it to them. It's something that the emails and meeting notes and it's very much around the content relating to that individual rather than just their name appearing on the signature. So I think with the situation we're in at the moment, there's potential that subject access requests may increase as companies go through redundancy processes, or if there are grievance processes going on because people are challenging decisions that have been made, maybe while people are on furlough. It's good to think through what level of information you're keeping about employees. Is it appropriate? Can you prune anything that shouldn't be kept at the moment? But obviously once you've had a subject access request in, you don't delete data about that individual until you know it's not part of the request, or you genuinely don't need it anymore. The next scenario was on a more minor scale than some of the ones that we've seen in the news, but a data processor of one of our clients had a ransomware breach. And that data processor notified the company about a month after it had happened and indicated that this event had occurred and that one of the servers that this company's data had been affected. And the company was really concerned that it had happened a month ago, that they hadn't been able to assess it or really understand what had happened. They were concerned, was this a breach or not? And they were concerned about how quickly they had been able or unable to report to the ICO in light of the delay in their data processor notifying them of that breach. So what happened was, when they actually explored it with their data processor, they found that actually it was a server that they didn't store any personal data on. So there was no breach of personal data and therefore no need for that particular breach to be reported to the ICO in that case. But it did make them think about the relationship they had with their processor and what that meant for the future and how they could improve that notification process. So what we took from that was really in terms of make sure when you're agreeing to share data or trust your personal data that you're responsible for with other organizations that are going to process it on your behalf, make sure that you agree a good data processor agreement and have a solid contract in place at the beginning of the project or contract. Think through what is it you expect will happen if a breach does occur. When do you expect them to report it through to you? They, as a data processor, have to tell you as a controller that that breach has happened, and it's your decision as the controller as to the severity of that breach and whether or not that gets reported through to the ICO. So you're the one that would have that responsibility for determining whether that report is necessary. So you need to be notified as soon as possible to be able to make that decision within the timescales of 72 hours. Whether you're a processor or whether you're a controller, do an initial assessment of every breach that you experience. Check what's included, how has it happened, who do you need to let know, particularly if you're a processor, who are the controllers whose data that you're processing have been affected, and what are their expectations? How can you notify them quickly to give them the best chance of responding quickly to this breach? And then maintaining, again, if you're a processor, again, if you're a controller, making sure that you have a good register of processing activities or information asset register, whatever you want to call it. That will help you understand what data has been breached based on where it's being stored. So if a particular system or server has been breached, you will be able to very quickly look and understand whether or not it's likely to affect individuals and their personal data, which again allows you to act more quickly. It allows you to assess the severity of that breach and hopefully prevent any harm coming to those individuals through quick action and reporting. And somewhat linked to that, obviously it's similar in terms of trusting data and putting it in other places, but selecting and using cloud software or systems. So we're talking about sort of cloud software and systems. It can be online client relationship management systems. It could be storage facilities like OneDrive, G Drive, Amazon Web Services. So that's what I'm referring to here really when looking at cloud software and systems. And the issue that we faced here was that a company that we knew was notified that some of their files were visible on the web. And when they looked into it, their IT company had been backing up their systems and servers on Amazon Web Services. And one of those had actually had permissions set wrongly. So it was allowing public access. So when obviously then something was Googled, a link to the name of the company was Googled, it actually came up with some of the files that they were responsible for. Now, luckily, the files were locked down and they were protected and you couldn't access the content of the files. But in the file name, there was limited personal data, an initial and surname, date of the incident that the company was dealing with on their behalf. So it had information that was at least identifiable, even if it wasn't significant levels of detail, but potentially could have been worse if the files hadn't been locked down. So what can we learn from this? So it's very easy when you're setting up cloud storage to miss boxes, to not fully understand who you're giving access to and where that access lies. So it's really important to, as you're setting it up, make sure you set it up properly, that you restrict permissions, and it's potentially better to restrict more than you need and then loosen up, as rather than have it more open and then try and restrict down. You can keep control of it and make sure that as you're testing and setting up the system, that you know that the people who need to have access and that it's not being seen more widely, whether it's more widely on an internal basis or external. Clearly making sure anything that has tick boxes that restrict public access is going to be absolutely key, because if you're using cloud storage to store your own company data that records HR information, it might record customer information, you don't want that to be publicly available to other people. I would also suggest to try and avoid using personal data in file names. That's an extra level of protection should data end up in the wrong place and you have protected the file. Just avoiding using personal data or identifiable information in the file name will then mean that any kind of potential breach will be less likely. Cloud systems and solutions are always based on a server somewhere, and that server will be somewhere in the world. So you need to have a think about, where is that server? Are you happy about the rules and regulations relating to data protection in that country? There are countries, obviously, that we already have agreements with where it's recognised that the data protection legislation is at the same level as we would expect here in the UK and across the EU. There are considerations in light of the new judgment about Privacy Shield, that US-based data which used to rely on Privacy Shield can no longer be transferred outside of the UK, and that's due to the local law enforcement and intelligence service legislation trumping the personal data right to privacy laws. And so because they're seen as more important in the US, it's deemed that there's less protection for an individual if their data is stored in the US. So at the moment, the ICO are looking to provide better guidance. They've got some initial guidance on their website, but in the first instance, you really need to understand where your data is in the world and be prepared to check for the other mechanisms that you can use around contract clauses, and genuinely checking that the data is of the same level of protection no matter where in the world it is. And that's being mindful of local legal systems and their data protection versus law enforcement legislation. The other elements that you need to think about here really are, what clarity have you provided to your staff around the software, systems and apps that they can use, particularly at the moment where people are working from home, which we'll come on to in a second. There might be a temptation for people, if they struggle with some of the systems that your organisation typically uses, that they might think, well, I know that this works really well, so I'm going to use this. And then suddenly the data that you have is in places either that you don't know, maybe less secure, or that breaches and you think that the organisational data is fine, and actually there is an effect because staff have unknowingly to you been using it because it's easier for them. So making sure they know what's whitelisted, what you're happy for them to use, if there's anything that you particularly want them to avoid because you don't accept the risks of using that particular software or system or app. And also a process for them to suggest new ideas can help. If they do know of something that they think is really useful and helpful, could it be something that would help the organisation? And if that suggestion comes through proper channels, you can then assess that and make sure that you're happy with the levels of data protection, privacy, and all of that element, the security, rather than just staff individually going off and using different apps and systems as they see fit. The final warning here really is just to think about, make sure if you are engaging external contractors or organizations and you might get them to help you set up cloud storage or ways of sharing information between yourself and another organization, maintain your responsibility for that cloud storage. We have heard of stories where, particularly particularly maybe external project management support or business support, have set up like business Dropboxes or Google Drive, and then at the point if the relationship is soured, the individual has almost held them to ransom in terms of not giving back access to, or primary access to, the company data, which they don't have the right to do, but because they've been the ones leading the administration, they've been providing logins, passwords, they've overall been managing that information on behalf of the company. Suddenly the company finds that they can no longer access it because they've been shut out and the contractor or third party now is taking control. So always maintain overall responsibility for your own cloud storage, and then provide access where you do need support from external companies, but make sure that you keep that overarching responsibility. And then finally, and I'm sure this isn't a surprise, one of the concerns we've had coming through a lot over the last few months has really been about people working from home and the increased risk of data breaches, or responding to some of the things like subject access requests that we've had earlier on in this session. So obviously it was a very quick adaptation companies had to make, and the first priority was, let's keep operational, let's get everybody working and mobile and focusing on that. And I think once those hurdles moved out the way, or they were achieved, that people were now routinely working from home, some of those more sort of niggles around data protection that have been there were coming to the forefront around how do we try and maintain people's engagement in good data protection practices? How do we reduce the risk of breaches, particularly where staff may now be sitting outside of all the security infrastructure that offices lend to them? You're now very much more reliant on individuals and their own behaviour and responsibility to make sure that they are protecting the company personal data. So we've had quite a number of queries come through around how can we effectively get messages across, how can we remind staff about their responsibilities, and then we've seen sort of significant breaches over the past couple of weeks with big companies, with Garmin, the third-party software in the US who support universities and charities here in the UK. They've had ransomware attacks, and they get into organisations through somebody clicking on a link. So these are the kind of worries now that are coming to the forefront for staff, where organisations have had to move quite quickly to working from home. So what we've kind of suggested is that obviously having your clear policies in place and the core training that you would regularly do play a key part. It's something that hopefully has been ongoing in your organisation for a while. But it's not just about that one-off training, and policies aren't always the most exciting thing to read. So not everybody will always sign up and read them, even if they have actually indicated that to you that they have done. So what we've suggested is trying to put in place a program loosely of regular reminders. So what are the kind of messages that you can circulate through the different communication mechanisms you have in your organisation? Can you make it a part of a team meeting or a catch-up conversations that you might be having? So, just a check-in of, are there any concerns? Has anyone seen any weird emails? What happens if you were to see one? That scenario discussion, so that it's not something that's forgotten or thought it's only applicable when it's in the office, but actually something that is brought to the forefront now as people are working in a different environment. Making sure that, example, just to making sure that, for a reminder around storage, making sure that just a reminder data is kept locked away because family members don't have the right to see it. So just little kind of reminders, and having those conversations on a regular basis help to keep it at the forefront. If you've got particular concerns or there's particular areas of worry, particularly sensitive data or a topic that you want to focus on those core concerns, and then make sure that the communications that you put out reinforce the good behaviour messages that you want to happen. So reminders around locking computers, storing them away, not downloading new software, or storing data in places that it shouldn't be stored. Making sure that if you want people to be storing data in the central network over a VPN, that they're not emailing it out to themselves and then saving it to their local drive. So just talking through some of the things that might be worrying you and flagging to staff that that behaviour still can't happen even though circumstances have changed. Have a think about agreed ways of working. What is it that on a daily basis staff can do that will help them just treat data well and handle it well? And so having those conversations and messages that reinforce ways of working will mean that they will see data protection as part of what they do, that it's not something that's on top of what they do already, that it's not this big burden, but it's actually a way of working that protects and secures personal data. And the other thing to think about is, as we said, we've kind of tried to encourage having that sort of little and often approach. So making sure that you're constantly drip feeding the key messages in a positive way as much as possible. So not inducing fear. It's something we try and avoid as well. It's about trying to make it a positive, engaging conversation, as opposed to something that makes somebody sigh and think, oh, not this again. So that little and often, keeping it in the forefront of people's minds really helps. And there was an example, and if you happen to listen to our podcast, you'll hear it next week, that Neil, a colleague of ours, was talking about where somebody in a reception, or if he's working at home, was complaining at their computer, and a colleague said, well, don't forget the training last week. If computers are running slowly and they're not working properly, it's potentially because it's a virus. They're like humans. If you get a virus or a cold, you slow down and you don't work well. It's the same with a computer. And so because she'd had the training the week before, it was in the forefront of her mind. So again, that little and often, keeping it front of people's mind will really help to make sure that bad behaviour doesn't build, or lazy behaviour, is often the case, doesn't build and then result in a data breach. So then thinking, what are the different mechanisms, just to summarise, that we've picked up on through the session today that you can try and draw on to make sure that you have in place. So your register of processing activities, that will make sure that you have a very clear picture about what's where, who has access to it, where it is in the world. So taking the time to map your data and document that will really help with anything to do with a data breach, a subject access request, staff knowing what data they can save in which system, and helps everybody to be much clearer about the way in which data is used across your organisation. The transparency element really is reinforced with privacy notices, so being very clear, open and honest about what you're doing. Even if it's lead generation, people will understand. It's better that you're open and honest about that use of lead generation tools. It makes the conversation easier if you end up using an unexpected email address. Having the processes in place to deal with data breaches and subject access requests is key, particularly at the moment where people are more dispersed and working from home. Having something that is an agreed process that you can prepare in advance, that then you can just kick into action at the point it happens. The times can be met, you can go through the process remotely if necessary, and actually continue to adhere to the requirements of the GDPR and the Data Protection Act. Making sure you have that accountability and the ability to demonstrate it, so that communication with staff, customers, if you're a charity, that you've got donors or membership organisation, all of those stakeholders, making sure that you can show them, if required, this is how we're complying. So always think about, how are we documenting our decisions? How are we making sure that we have the right information in place? And how do we communicate those key messages with staff, which then leads on to good staff engagement. So there is that place for formal staff training, but making sure it's not just a one-off every year or every couple of years, but there is an ongoing conversation, and that will really bring success and a culture of good data protection to your organisation. And I've seen that in some of the organisations we've worked with where they've really committed to it, and it always brings a little bit of joy to my heart when I see that. So finally, just if you've got some more questions or resources that you'd like to find out, we've got previous webinars are available all on our YouTube channel. You can watch those for free, and always get in touch if you've got questions that you'd like to delve in a little bit deeper with us. Kelly has spoken recently at the Business in Oxford event, which is available again on our YouTube channel. And we're doing a regular weekly podcast where we're talking about what's going on in the news, and it ranges from data breaches to ways data is used. It's just a general chit chat and hopefully makes it interesting. So please listen to those. We always try and pull through some learning points as well, but it's a little bit less formal than our webinars. And obviously our website, there's a lot of information on there. We've got resources on there. So please do make use of them. They're there for you to hopefully help you, guide you through some of the queries and questions you have around data protection. But we are always at the end of the phone or an email if you'd like to have a conversation with us directly. So thank you very much for listening. Does anyone have any questions at this point that they'd like me to answer? Please feel free to type in the chat box. I think our next webinar will be in 2 weeks' time. Kelly will be back on that one, I believe. And yes, if you've got any questions or any feedback on the webinar, I'd be very happy to hear from you. Otherwise, I would say thank you very much indeed for your time. Enjoy the rest of the sunny afternoon and hopefully the weekend. A recording, we will have a recording of this session. So, and that will be available early next week. What we will do is email anybody who has attended the session with a link to the recording, and then they're all available on our YouTube channel as well. So we will email you next week with that. We do offer training. If you'd like to have a call to discuss training, then I'd be very happy to ping you an email afterwards, if that's okay. I can see the request for training there. So if you'd like me to, I can arrange that next week with you as well. Thank you all very much. I wish you a lovely weekend. Enjoy the sunshine and hopefully see you again soon.